I am joined by a fantastic panel, and it's going to be a real delight to introduce them to you. But before I do so, I do want to point out some things about the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and some of the roles that we're trying to play as the COVID pandemic changes our world. The Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London is just over 2 years old. We're a research institute that is dedicated to looking at the obstacles that prevent women in all walks of life from coming through for leadership. That means we take a pipeline approach every step of a woman's work-life journey where she has been treated differently than a man would have been treated. We do original research. We also aggregate and promulgate the research of others. We very much want to break down the silos and bring the evidence base together. We also want to translate that evidence base into the hands of people who can use it. And so this webinar is in pursuit of that. It's in pursuit of that question of translation of the research base, because we have on the line with us decision makers who would no doubt already be asking themselves, what am I going to do as we move back post the harshest of the COVID lockdown restrictions? What is my organisation, what is my workplace going to look like? How can I manage for that new normal in a way that also equips the goals that I have for diversity generally and particularly for gender diversity? In this webinar, we are going to be bringing to you some information that the Global Institute for Women's Leadership has compiled. In particular, we wanted people to note that survey data taken in 2019 showed that on average, around 30% of the UK workforce had had an experience with working from home. In some upper managerial ranges, that extended to statistics more like 40% and 50%. But it does cause us to pause, I think, and say how much our world has changed, because if you asked yourself about your organisation right now and asked how many people have had an experience working from home, for many of us, the answer to that now would be 100%. Before we entered this COVID pandemic era, we do know that flexible working, working from home, employees being able to make decisions about when they work and where they work had some positive spin-offs. It's been associated with job retention. It's been associated with more work-life balance. It's been associated in some surveys with job satisfaction. But it's not all a rosy picture when you look at the data about flexible work. There is also studies and information that show that particularly people who work from home feel stigmatised. The expression shirking from home is used in too many workplaces, that people working from home feel overlooked for promotions and training opportunities, that they work excess hours, and in particular, the data shows that women are less likely to be compensated for those excess hours. As we look forward, there will be many employers who might be thinking to themselves as they readjust to the world that they do want to cut costs. Real estate is expensive. And so they may be saying to themselves, having had this experience of virtual working, that they want to retreat their office footprint and have more people working from home. The data on that is pretty clear too. It shows that virtual work, including working from home, tends to be embraced by employees if they feel that they've got some control over it. Whereas if it's imposed, and particularly comes potentially with employer surveillance as to how long people are online, that is associated with declining job satisfaction. That evidence base has caused us to ask the question that we're posing to our stellar panel today, which is flexibility, engagement, diversity. Can we have it all? Are we headed to some new working nirvana where these things are combined? or are the tensions between them so profound that making an impact on one causes challenges on the other? To give us views on that essential question, I'm going to turn now to our panel. We've got a great lineup here, and I'm going to invite the first panelist to speak for 5 minutes now. Her name is Sue Asprey-Price. She's the UK Director of Corporate Affairs for that incredibly well-known global brand in real estate services, JLL. So Sue, over to you.
Great, thank you, Julia. As Julia mentioned, I work in the real estate industry, so an interesting time, interesting market right now. And as Julia said, we do a lot of work with corporate occupiers and how they occupy their space and how they really support their workforce and make people as productive as possible. And in particular, in relation to the office, right now, we are going through a period with a number of our corporate occupier clients to determine what's the purpose of the office. As Julia has said, we've seen companies that are 100% working from home. We've seen some headlines come out from CEOs around the fact that they don't need an office anymore because they have supported this remote working. So with that comes huge benefits. And in actual fact, again, many of our corporate occupiers are looking at this as a true opportunity to extend the labor pool that they have access to. Now, I would say we are also seeing some feedback coming back that people do miss the office, especially younger generations that are missing the kind of ad hoc mentoring that they receive within an office environment, that they don't feel that they've got the right work environment to work within at home. So really, this is a complicated jigsaw puzzle, I would say, and most of our corporate occupiers are really trying to determine what is the purpose of the office, why do people need to come into it, and what should they receive and what experience should they have when they go into the office. But in order to determine that, to Julia's point, looking at flexibility, looking at remote working and how it can be built into a business model has come under a much higher level of scrutiny right now, and in a positive way. I go back to the fact that many organizations now are looking at this as a true opportunity to have an extended labor team. The other thing I would say is we've actually been doing, as part of our workplace strategy group, looking at the physiological benefits or not of working from home. So we've been doing some work with our corporate occupiers, actually using wearables, where we are essentially looking at the impact of remote working on individuals. And some of the findings are fascinating. Right now, obviously, some of our stress levels are higher. For those of you that are trying to do homeschooling, working, and I've realized now I'm actually an amateur hairdresser as well, all of it can be quite stressful. So that certainly heightened our stress levels. But what we are finding is that actually we're sleeping more. So we're just having that bit of extra time. And actually the cognitive capability of people when they're working from home and having concentration time has increased. And what that data is now telling us is that, to Julia's point, there's a benefit to having some people working from home in the right environment. And as a result of that, we're getting the real-time data to show this makes good business sense. And I know that all of us are passionate about the fact that diversity and inclusion makes good business sense. But what we're now seeing is that some of this data is indicating that an element of remote working is actually increasing productivity. So isn't that fascinating that all of a sudden remote working will become part of business models, will become part of the norm, which, to Julia's point, will break down some of the stigma. Because if we can prove that actually that is part of an increasing productivity gain for organizations, they will be very focused on how they build this in. So what I would say as a closing remark, and then I'll hand it on to our next panelist, is that the office isn't going away. It's going to redefine its purpose as a response to COVID. I think the experience that people have within offices will improve, which again should really help our diversity and inclusion drive that we're all focused on. And actually remote working will become part of business models. Having people stay connected to their organization and their brand through that is going to be fundamentally a big part of what people do. And the last thing I'd say, to Julia's point, changing managers, how managers are actually building this in to their engagement with their teams, how they manage without presenteeism being the top priority, is going to be fundamentally a big shift in the way that we see how we adopt this. And I would say, again, our statistics that are coming out is that female managers are faring a bit better in the current circumstance. So just to say that, again, this should help to promote a new way of working, and something that I feel will certainly turn the tide now in terms of having flexibility built into the way that people work.
Julia, we can't hear you.
There we go. I fixed that. Thank you very much, Sue. And I'm sure your contribution has sparked in the minds of those listening a number of questions, and I'm sure that is going to be true of the rest of the panel as well. If people have questions, we will have an opportunity at the end to ask a few from the audience. If you use the Q&A function to put your question in, please do that. But I turn now to Dr. Hee-Jung Chung, who is a reader in sociology and social policy at the University of Kent. And very importantly for this purpose, she's the principal investigator for the work autonomy, flexibility and work-life balance project. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. So just a bit of background. So I've been looking into the impact of flexible working on workers for the kind of over about 10 years. So a lot of it actually is based on what we found before COVID, before everybody, as Julia said, pretty much everybody who can work from home was working from home. And just to kind of answer some of the questions about like diversity, engagement, and flexibility. So absolutely, flexible working, even before COVID, and especially during COVID, during the lockdown and school closures, enables those, especially with care responsibilities, to maintain their labor market positions. So we're not talking about just mothers and people with childcare responsibilities, but also elderly care. And one thing that we don't really talk much about is about self-care, people with any kind of illnesses or kind of disabilities that may prevent them from working or going into the office. So these are really great opportunities to see the extent to which people who were unable to maybe partake in the office or in the labor market as much as they would have wanted to, how much of this home working or the normalization of home working has improved those elements. But having said that, I think there are some couple of things that we need to think about to really ensure that flexibility does lead to diversity engagement, some of which Sue and Julia have already spoken about. One thing just before I go on, just to note that, when we talk about diversity, we need to think about not just gender, but ethnicity, sexuality, gender orientations, etc. And we are really talking about diversity here in terms of gender and care responsibilities. But one thing that we need to do is, so from the studies I've done, if we don't change our current work cultures about what is good work, what is an ideal work, or what is what does commitment and motivation look like, if we don't change those ideas, flexible working can actually lead to bad results, such as workers working longer hours, not having really the clear demarcation between work and family life, which actually leads workers to, in the longer run, have higher levels of stress or lower levels of well-being outcomes. What is more, although some of the studies I have done have shown that allowing mothers to have control over when and where they work is incredible in terms of allowing them to kind of keep their slightly longer hours, stressful, but very lucrative jobs. So really ensuring that we maintain the pipeline, make sure that there are, key women in leadership positions, really crucial. Having said that, that kind of flexibility that women have reinforces the traditional gender division of labor. So that flexibility is asked to be used for women to perform their care roles and not really disrupt the kind of the unequal division of household labor. And this is something that we also see during COVID lockdown, where we see that a lot of women asked and were given the flexibility, or the working from home resulted in different results for men and women, where women are doing more of the care work. Men are doing more than before, but not as much as women have increased, which has really severe, implications for what's going to happen post-COVID. Are we going to see an exodus? Especially when we know that, and we just talked about just before this webinar, schools are not likely to open anytime soon. So what's going to happen in the future? Which leads me to the second point I want to make, is about when we talk about flexibility, we can't talk about just women or people with care responsibly. Well, we care responsibly, we need to get dads to work flexibly. And this is one thing that, I'm really trying to push, is that I think managers understand that, women do need that flexibility, especially in these extraordinary times. But one of the things we really need to get people to think about is dads and men and senior men, and, again, not just people with, young children, but everybody to think about flexibility. And as Sue said, flexibility as a performance measure, as a strategy to really enhance performance rather than some sort of a work-life diversity project. And this is something that we really need to push. And to do that, we need to start looking at all workers, not just mothers, as workers who are not just embedded in companies, but in the household and communities and larger families. And without doing that, we might see actually some of the negative consequences, such as stigma and other kind of working longer, etc., in the future as well. And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Let me unmute. Thank you very much. I've been looking at the questions that are coming in, so we're getting some great questions from the audience, which is fantastic. But I'm going to turn now for a contribution to our next panellist, Atherley Williams, who is the Chief People Officer of global mining giant BHP. Atherley, over to you.
Thanks, Julia. And many people often look at a company like BHP, which is a large globally dispersed mining and resources company, and think flexible working and diversity can't really be part of how we operate. It's a journey that we've been on now for some years. We've had a very strong push to achieving gender balance over the past, probably coming up on 3 years now. And a central component of the solutions we've been really focused on has been really flexibility. And we saw that as one of the key levers to unlocking a much larger talent pool for us, and also in retaining initially women. But what we found as we've gone on this journey, one of the most surprising parts for us is the uptake by men. And it's really been a key enabler of destigmatizing flexibility. So we have just under around half our workforce working flexibly in some way, shape or form. And flexibility in a mining operation may mean everything from job sharing, flexible work rosters at our operational sites, through to working from home in a corporate setting. So we've really sort of cast the net wide on what flexible working could look like in our organisation. We've got around half, just under, people who tell us now that they work flexibly in some way. And of those working flexibly, 70% of them are men. And I think men themselves have been incredibly surprised about the value that they've got in balancing their own work and lives by being able to avail themselves of far more flexible options. So I absolutely agree with the comments around the importance of getting dads to work flexibly, and the importance of line leaders and senior executives role modelling flexibility as well, because it takes it from being something that is reserved for women and those with caring responsibilities and brings it into, here's how we're going to run our workplace, and it makes it far more normal. What I would say is that there are a lot of organisations who want to bring in flexibility. They're just not quite sure how to do it, and it becomes a bit scary, it comes a bit hard, and they find themselves really going hard after rolling out a set of policies, a set of rules, a set of who can work flexibly, how you can work flexibly. And at the core of that, it takes out the very thing you're trying to deliver to people through flexible working options, which is choice. So I do think we can have flexibility, engagement, and diversity. But at the core of it, for me, there are two key elements that have to be in place. And the first of those is trust. I really get concerned when I hear of organisations wanting to roll out monitoring software and those sorts of things, because it keeps us in the realm of performance is about time in front of the computer or time at the desk, where we should be having conversations about performance is about results and outcomes. We hire really smart people and then we treat them like children. So I think we need to shift leaders' ways of looking at performance and have a different dialogue about that. We've done a lot of surveying of our own workforce, and we've found that where we have people working flexibly, they report greater levels of wellness than the group average. So we know that where people have choice and they're able to work flexibly, it does deliver greater levels of wellness. But we've also been surveying during this COVID period, and the results have been really interesting. So across our organisation, those who are office-based and have been forced to work 100% remotely versus those who work in our mine operations and are able to continue working at the mine site, the ones in the office have a significantly lower sense of reporting their own health and wellness than the overall group average. Women are demonstrably lower than men in terms of office work-based workers and how they feel about their health and wellness. And the group that are reporting the lowest levels of their own wellness and well-being are women aged 30 to 39, which goes back to some of the earlier comments around carers' responsibilities, homeschooling, bearing the brunt of, just the things that COVID has thrust upon us. So I do think there's some really interesting insights to unpack around the impact on mental health and wellness. But I come back to where I sort of started my comments. For me, it is very much around ensuring that as we prosecute flexible working for more and more people, we really put trust and choice at the centre of how we go about implementing the solutions.
Thank you very much, Athalie. Fantastic contribution. I'm going to come now to our final panellist, Dr. Zoe Young, who is a researcher and the author of Women's Work, How Mothers Manage Flexible Working in Careers and Family Life, right on the theme that we're talking about. Zoe, over to you.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm an academic. I've been working in the flexible working space for around 10 years. I have an HR background. So I have been on both sides, studying flexible working and its intersections with gender and caring. And also, being a practitioner responsible for designing and implementing flexible working policy and changing practice in organisations. So they're my lenses. As for the question, can we have diversity, engagement and flexibility in a post-COVID workplace? Well, my take on that is absolutely yes. And I would go a bit further and say that a well-designed and well-executed flexible working strategy is potentially at the heart of it. But the design and the implementation are the key points. From an employee perspective, flexibility is consistently ranked a top 3 job priority, along with career development opportunities and reward. And what flexibility means to employees is having choice, a degree of choice about working patterns and the ability to control and adjust the hours, the time, the timing and the location of work as and when life circumstances demand it, without consequence. So without losing a role, without being sidelined, without being excluded or overlooked. Now, like Hee Jung, my big study around flexible working is pre-COVID, but my 5-year study of women managers in global businesses and in large UK public sector organisations recorded many stories of burnout and stress as women grappled with trying to make their individual flexible work arrangements work in a context that had not flexed when they had. So managing full-time workloads in part-time hours and for part-time pay in many cases. Little support or guidance about how to redesign the job while you do it. Bending themselves out of shape to fit into organisational routines and habits about where and when meetings happen. And this is when flexibility backfires, when it's not the norm, when it is seen as an exception or a perk even. And the responsibility to make it work is loaded entirely on the individual. Now, for 3 months during the COVID crisis, we have created a new norm around home working and probably highly personalized work schedules as work and caring have collided for large numbers of the working population. And what we've probably learned is that home working does not suit everybody all of the time in exactly the same way as full-time office-based working did not support everybody to do their best work all of the time. One size very definitely does not fit all. So for organizations thinking about if we can have all three, diversity, engagement, and flexibility, I do offer some considerations. The first is that home working is but one form of flexible working. There are hundreds of possible combinations of hours, schedules, and location flexibility. And if you like numbers, I did put a number on this by calculating the possible combinations based on UK policy and came up with around 300 possible flexible job designs. Now, not everyone is feasible in every job. There are very good reasons why nurses are in hospitals, why builders are on sites, and why chefs are in restaurants. But my argument is that organizations will benefit enormously from this broader and more nuanced understanding of the different forms flexibility can take in different roles. And they need that to be able to design the jobs that people want to do now and next, and the environments that people want to need to be able to perform well. So what's going to be really important for organizations going forward is to realize that, you know, a blanket that won't work here around flexibility is not going to be believed or be acceptable to the vast majority of employees who have been part of this mass home working experiment. A second thing that's going to be important is, of course, understanding your constraints, the big immovables that limit the type of flexibility you can make available in a role, and then work out how to empower employee choice around what you can do on hours, schedules, and locations, and not just for a few people. I mean, we've said this already, but you know, not the few people perhaps with a diversity flag attached to them, as parents and carers, for example, but consider what the universal offer is. What's the offer for everyone? Flexing the front line, flexing key worker roles in your organizations, that might be teachers, that might be carers, that might be call handlers for whom working from home has not been an option during this crisis. This will be vital to their continuing engagement. And this is the opportunity to think about what flexibility could look like in those roles and how it can strengthen the way that an organization moves from lockdown to recovery. And finally, my final point about this is that designing the jobs that people want to do, that genuinely deliver work-life balance and productivity and performance, designing flexibility into them that in a way that delivers what the business needs, is a skill. And right now, many operational and people managers are developing that skill on their feet, on the go, working it out as they go along. And I position that this capability, this work design, this job design capability is vital and needs support and strengthening within organizations, because it will simply future-proof the organization.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I'm going to pose a question now to each of the panelists who just need to unmute themselves to answer it. And I'm going to draw on some of the threads that are coming through the question line as well. Most of the contributions we've just heard made reference to choice and flexibility being about choice. But we are going to be in a period, and I just want to push the panel on this, when many employers and organisations are making decisions about embracing virtual home-based work as part of a cost-cutting exercise. We all know that the economic world that we're emerging into is not a good one. Economies are under real strain. Businesses are under real strain. Many of them have proved that this model can work during this period. And so they are thinking about how can we do this in a way that saves costs, you know, less office space, more virtual work. I'm going to throw to the whole panel. What, if you had to give the top 3 things for an organisation to think about that was in that paradigm, what would they be? And then I'm going to specifically throw to Athalie. Do you think those stress figures you were seeing around 35-year-old plus women were reflections of homeschooling? So that's not going to be there for forever, or it is more baked in than that? And I'm going to throw to Sue as part of this. There's a lot of intrigue about what's going to happen with all this office space, and you would be the woman who knows the answer to that. So, yeah, I'm happy to take people in whatever order. Sue, maybe if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, that's fine. So in terms of organizations and the 3 things that they need to think about, I'd say point number 1 is making sure that any kind of remote working, and Zoe was absolutely right, you know, this isn't just home working, it's having an alternative environment that may be somewhere that's close to home. Certainly the immediate response that we've seen from COVID is that there's a huge hesitation to travel on public transport. So actually some more traditional out-of-town offices that organizations have are turning into kind of hubs where people can go into. So I think don't just think about remote working, to Zoe's point, as just being at home. The second point I'd say is that remote working does also need to be supported. So even though it's a cost-cutting opportunity potentially to decrease square footage, you know, Google announced last week in the headlines that they were going to be giving, I think it was about $1,000 per person to support the remote working environment. Again, some of the reviews that we've been doing is that people have been sitting on dining room chairs for 3 months, and that's actually, although health and well-being, to Athalie's point, is supported by remote working and flexibility, think about the physical environment that people are sat within, and don't just assume we're going to cut all that cost and we're not going to have to support people in the way that we normally would from a health and safety and well-being perspective in the office. So something to think about. And then the third is, I'm going to say it again, that, and I think everybody on the panel has emphasized this, that actually there still is a purpose for an office, an environment for collaboration. And if we look at what is the purpose of the office coming out of this, I think, you know, a sea of white desks across multiple floors with zero atmosphere, with zero kind of encouragement for collaboration, that is the bit of the office environment that we see as really not really going to have a purpose going forward. If people come to the office, it's often because they want to have a learning experience, they want to have the mentoring that I mentioned, and they also want to have socialization. And although that feels really foreign to us right now, that is exactly where we're landing. And most people, when they talk about flexible working, our stats are coming through that actually not a huge number of people want to work remotely 100% of the time, that they still want to be able to go and connect, and they still want to go into an office. And the one thing that I'd say to your point, Julie, around what's going to happen to all this office and real estate, I think it will rebrand itself. It will become something different than it is today. Yes, we will see a decrease in square footage. The immediate response to COVID is actually very few occupiers are decreasing their square footage in the immediate response because they need to adhere to social distancing. So they actually need that extra space. So what we are seeing is that typical density rules are kind of being blown out the window right now. They're using that space. In the future, we do see a reduction, but really what we see is that that office will become something that people go to have a great experience, to align with the brand. And so any landlords or anyone out there that we're talking to right now, we are really saying, consider the experience people have when they come into your office. Consider that they're there for socialization, learning, collaboration, engagement, and make sure that your office environment in particular supports and encourages that, which is quite different than some of the offices that we experience today. Some occupiers have shifted that a lot over the last few years. And really what I'd say is that we're seeing an acceleration of that shift being driven by COVID. I think it was always there. This is just accelerating it, and making sure that people, I'm going to say it again, have a tremendous human experience when they go into an environment.
Thank you very much, Sue. Athalie, I'm going to throw to you on the top three, but also that question about women, particularly mid-age range women.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start quickly with the top three. I think the point that was made earlier around job design is pivotal. We can't go into offering flexible work and not come back to the fundamentals of what is the work, how can it be done, and how can we think about doing it very differently. And if you start from first principles, you can come up with really creative solutions. Point two, I think, goes to the heart of the culture of an organisation. It's got to become a normal part of how we work around here. And so there's a lot of work that needs to go hand in hand with flexible work policies and job design solutions around the broader cultural aspects as well. And that goes down to things that may sound very simple, but how do you help a leader learn to check in with people when you're not when they're located virtually rather than in the same office as you? What are the skills a leader needs to do a genuine check-in, to really understand what's going on for a person that they may not see face-to-face very regularly? The third piece for me is enroll your people in solving for this. We found that our teams are incredibly creative in solving for what flexible working needs to look like. And don't assume that there's a one-size-fits-all solution. What I need will be very, very different to what you need with flexibility. And, you know, what a team who's working night shift in one of our operations needs in terms of flexible working, they'll know, and they will be able to come together and design solutions and come back and share those with you. And you'll come up with some phenomenal creativity and solutions that really work and that people want and that they own. And when you've got a vested interest in designing that solution, you will really have a vested interest in making it work. So they'd be my top three. In terms of the stress figures, there were a couple of really interesting sort of next level down details we found in that women in the 30 to 39 year age bracket. We asked them, how are you feeling? How do you feel about your own health and wellness? And then we said, why are you feeling that way? So we got some insight into what were some of the underlying drivers in the reports. It was very much around feeling like they were juggling multiple jobs. I won't just say two jobs, it was multiple: homeschooling, caring, all of the things that come with trying to juggle just multiple competing demands on time. There was another group, though, that we saw that had low scores as well, and they were younger people who were often living alone, single, didn't have a family support unit right around them, and who relied heavily on their friends for support and for that kind of social connection. And that was all kind of blocked from them, and they were really struggling as well, because they'd lost their friendship connection and they'd lost the connection with work colleagues. And so they were the two groups where we saw the underlying data really coming to the fore.
And Athalie, can I just press you, because it's coming through on the Q&A, how different were those results between men and women?
They were significantly different. They were in some cases, depending where in the world the teams were based, they were statistically significantly different, to the order of 10 to 20% gap.
Right. With women finding it more difficult in general. Yes.
Yeah.
Hee Jung.
Yes. I mean, I think Sue and Athalie just have really pointed out such important points, and I just kind of maybe want to piggyback on that. I think, again, the key thing is that, as Zoe said, as Sue said, and Athalie said, it's like you can't just have one system that works, and you can't have it imposed. And I think one of the things that we do see is that a lot of workers have gone through this experience and have learned so much themselves about what works for them, what doesn't. And also, to try to get as much engagement as possible, because I think workers understand exactly what kind of flexibility works from them. But also, maybe this is a good time to think about, of the work that people do, what was meaningful? What were some of the priorities of work that they need to carry out, and where? And related to that, as Adelaide said, well, some of the data that we also collected on kind of COVID working from home, but also in other data, is that one of the things that people don't like about working from home is the social isolation, not being able to engage with colleagues in a social manner, as like kind of the water cooler conversation, which again is not just about socializing, it's also about socializing, but it's also about learning. That's where you do a lot of kind of informal learning and networking. Now, with the home working during COVID, again, this wasn't prepared. There was no, I mean, some companies were prepared and organizations adapted incredibly during this period, but a lot of companies were not, were unable to. And this is a really good time to learn from some companies. For example, a lot of them kind of based in the Silicon Valley, where majority of the work is done remotely, where there are no offices, and the extent to which they actually try to engage and try to recreate some of that social environment when there is no office, because a lot of those things we didn't intentionally plan them, but they came about. So these were unplanned but very positive impact of working together, and these things now have to either go virtual, they don't necessarily have to be in the office, or really intentionally plan so that you have that physical connections with people and you have that bonding experience, or have that kind of informal interactions in person. But again, these are things that once we do try to push workers more remotely, that you need to think about. And again, getting workers engaged. And one thing related to that, we need to think about the office, the workspace, as well as kind of broadband capacity. And these are kind of the things that came out in other countries. So the Netherlands have already for a very long time, for decades, have a system where the government will, the employers through the government will provide you cost for your broadband if you provide that you do some work on it. So again, having broadband, it's not just about personal use anymore, and the managers may need to support that. And also with younger workers, they might not have the physical kind of space to work at home. And in Korea, there is now a debate about if companies want workers to work remotely, do they need to pay the rent? Because you're effectively making workers use their own space to work. Then are you going to provide a part of the rent so that they could expand their house to have a home office? Or are you going to pay them the membership fees for some of these kind of remote offices? And so maybe this is some of the discussions we need to have. And just final thing about the stress levels that Hadley talked about. I think this is really interesting and important, and again goes back to this whole gender norm thing, is that working from home sometimes isn't the best thing for some people, especially maybe in the very future looking. So again, I know some mothers who don't want to work from home because they cannot not do their second, third job, which is about caring, housework, etc. They literally physically need to detach themselves away from home sometimes to be able to concentrate. And I mean, these are, I'm not saying everybody is, but it's a very complex matter where you need to look at that various context and to be able to kind of really try to get the right balance, if you want, in going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. Zoe.
Yes, well, to the point about choice, choice is such an important ingredient of flexible working, and it is the one thing that people haven't had through this period. So we've completely flipped the default to 100% working from home. So choice has been completely removed, which is possibly behind some of the very great urges people feel to be doing their work in different places and connecting with people in different ways. So reintroducing choice and considering what kind of flexibility works in what roles is really, really important. And I draw on some of the experimental work that I do with organizations to just illustrate how important it is to take this away from the individual and make designing the creative job design solutions and the how much, where and when people should work, to make that a team challenge. Because so very often flexible working is an individual solution, a highly individualized solution, and any organizational change is attempted sort of top down through policy. And actually work happens usually in teams. You might not be co-located, but a vast majority of sort of even knowledge work and interactive managerial work in organizations is a team thing. And so often one individual's flexible work adjustment, particularly around part-time hours, becomes another's overtime or creates tensions in teams. So one way of engaging and coming up with some creative solutions is absolutely to work with work teams to brainstorm and come up with the ways that work fairly for everyone in a work group. It's not cost-free to set up good home working environments. So organizations thinking about what to do with offices need to be well aware of the cost and impact on having a suboptimal system of technology and privacy and security for people working from home. And I think where we will get to with job design and thinking about how flexibility is built into roles and the way that teams perform, is that I think we'll get much more tuned in to the types of spaces that will be useful depending on the particular activity that we're going to be involved in. So when is it vital that we come together in person to do what? What kind of work relies and benefits from interaction? What kind of work relies and benefits from close solo working? And I think we'll get much smarter at working that out for ourselves, how we work best to do which kinds of work. And I think that can be very well supported by organizations on activity-based spatial planning and also temporal planning, about using time better to reflect that knowledge work, for example, creative work might benefit from bigger blocks of time rather than chopped up days. You know, I think we'll get much more tuned in to working in those kinds of ways.
A big thread coming through on the Q&A line is about managers and line managers in particular, and we're asking them to do a lot. I mean, they've got to manage their way out of this pandemic lockdown to socially distanced offices. They are then being asked to think through what of this world of virtual and flexible work should become part of the business's ongoing norm. How do they get that right with choice, flexibility, engagement? How do they do it to encourage diversity? How do they have ways of checking on employees' welfare when engaging like this is much more part of how they see people? How do they ultimately re-engineer merit and promotion structures so they're focused on outputs rather than inputs, so we don't create some new form of presenteeism, which is you've got to be, you know, on your video conference and online from, you know, 5 a.m. until midnight, or people think you aren't seriously at task. How best can we equip managers to do that? And what's the risk that, you know, at the top leadership level of corporations, there is a new vision, but it doesn't translate down to the line managers that need to enact it? I'm happy to throw that to anybody who wants to have a go at it.
I'll jump in very quickly. I do think it is about teaching line leaders a new muscle, and they need to develop that muscle. And for many line leaders, they've got the right intention, that they want to make it work, they just don't know how to. So I think it's a real combination. There's no one lever you can pull here. It's about talking about, this is new for us, we need to learn how to do it. Here are some basic tools, here are some basic skills, here is some support that we can give you. And, you know, it may be some very, very simple tools, but then supporting line leaders to put them into practice. How do you have a check-in conversation with someone via a Zoom or a WebEx? What are the toolkits you need to equip them with? And then I think role modeling from senior leaders is key, because nothing will kill something faster in an organisation than if a senior leader says one thing and does another. Because the middle managers that we're relying on to really make flexibility work will be looking at their boss and their boss's boss and saying, I need to be like them. So making sure that your CEO, your executive team are all role modeling and building that same muscle too, I think is also key to making it work.
Thank you. Zoe.
I think pre-COVID, this is the way we frame things now. I think line managers were in a really difficult position when receiving a perhaps an individual request for flexibility. They may accept that for a well-regarded, high-performing person, employee, but they may worry about opening the floodgates to lots of requests for flexibility and different kinds of flexibility and how they manage that in a team. And for a long time, I think managers have been in a very, very difficult position in reconciling those situations. So I made the point about capability, and there are some sort of really technical aspects to job design that are important. And then there are some very human aspects for working out the right kinds of flexibility depending on the work that you do. And this is simply not taught, in a formal way. This is sort of learned on the job. So I think there is an opportunity for teaching in the more technical and the human aspects of this kind of work. This new way of managing people going forward. And I think managers need frameworks for making decisions about flexibility that work for their business. So for that to work, it's to Athalie's point, which is if there's leadership intent, if there is a message that says, no, we want flexibility, and this is why flexibility matters to our business, and this is what it can look like and do for us and do for you, then managers have got the license and the framework to start making some really useful decisions that affect human lives and the daily experience of work.
Can I just add to that? Yes, I really think both what's been said is fantastic. And I just want to kind of add to that. I think what we need to really think about more strategically, and do bear in mind, I'm a sociologist, not in the HR, but some of the studies that have been done by colleagues, especially in the US, is that you're talking about completely changing KPIs, that we need to think about what is the key goals that organizations are going to try to meet. And to maybe embed some of that work-life balance, happier workforce as one of the KPIs as a manager, because managers are trying to meet those goals. Like they're meeting goals, especially middle managers are meeting goals that are set by senior leaders about what they feel like this organization's goals are. And those then have to be really embedded in those very, very important KPIs that are being sent to those middle managers as the goals to meet. And secondly, rather than trying to, again, with the business leaders and the managers trying to figure out how to teach middle managers, I think a lot of that learning can actually come from the workers themselves. Really interesting experimental studies that have been done in a very long, like a long period of time in the US is about having workshops about, again, reevaluating what is the goal of not just the organization, but the work team itself. And what are the ways in which we know that are kind of frivolous things that are not really necessary? And what are some of the key things that we're doing as a collective? And how can we actually make it better? And really completely changing the ideas of productivity and performance and motivation. And again, this is not just managers. Workers themselves have some of those really, in a way, bad kind of work cultures embedded in them, because that's what they've learned throughout long periods of time. So, doing that as a collective and together and try to kind of reshape the goals as a team, I think is really crucial in trying to do this, and also relieves managers. One thing that I would say though is one thing about remote working as well as flexible working is that workers, because the boundaries between work and other aspects of life is blurred, that managers almost need to be much more active in protecting workers from overworking themselves. And this is something we see during COVID, but also before in some of the data that we saw. Again, not just in the US, UK, and even Germany, where that flexibility sometimes need to be managed so that to protect workers rather than to make workers work longer and harder. And these are some of the new techniques that kind of managers need to do, but is only possible when you have that dialogue and KPIs are changed so that well-being is put forward.
Thank you. Sue.
Yeah, I would say I agree with everything that all the panelists have said. And I think, you know, one of the benefits that we have seen from COVID, and I can't remember if it was Zoe or Athelia who said the human side, right? We've all had it where we've had dogs barking, we've had kids come onto our calls. And actually, one of the great things that's happened, whether it be clients or employees or employers, we've broken down a barrier. And that, because of the period of time we've been working in this way, is something that's sticking. And I think that personalization has actually changed the way that people are working. And that's something that I think is going to be more accepted and more tolerated when we come out the other side of this. I'd also agree with Hee-Jung around the KPIs and setting that. A lot of the organizations that we're working with and our clients now are really thinking about their own purpose as a company. This has really made companies stop and think, what do we want to be known as? And again, all of the statistics and all of the research coming out is that those companies that can land on their true purpose will fare better out of this crisis. So some of that is around their commitment to sustainability and where they are committing themselves to that. A lot of it is around diversity and inclusion and employee happiness, the recognition that, you know, those organizations that can really truly support that, whether that be through remote working, whether that be through diversity and inclusion, whether that just be from, you know, having a really good friendly families group that people can have peers that they can engage with. Going back to what is our purpose? Why are we here? What do we want to be known as a business, and how do we support our employees? It's really, I think, changing the dynamic. And, you know, we work with a lot of clients that are doing this. We ourselves as an organization are doing this. And, you know, we are putting some levels of KPIs in because it's almost, again, saying these are the acceptable things as a manager that not only do we want to encourage you to consider, but it's part of our purpose as a firm. So we expect you to consider it. So that to me is some of the breaking down some of what we refer to as a bit of the frozen middle, where you've got some middle managers who are quite stuck in their ways or maybe have bought into a historic culture that they've really struggled to change. So some of it's around aligning to your company's purpose, but also giving those managers a reason and a purpose to deliver against those objectives. So I think this is one of those things that we are seeing a significant shift that, again, maybe a response to COVID that's been accelerated as we've seen more and more organizations trending towards this, but I think it's happening a lot quicker now.
Thank you. So that's a fantastic final note, and I'm going to build on it. We at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership have been clear all along about our purpose, but we've had to think again, what does this era mean for what we do? When we are able to gather people in person, we are very committed to making sure that through executive education, we're able to share up-to-the-minute evidence about what works in gender, to get it into the hands of managers and those who can make a difference. And so if anybody online is interested in that, please get into contact with us. But in the time in between, what we want to bring to people is events like this that combine new insights, because each of you has pointed to sources of data and evidence that are right up to the minute, new insights with analysis and views that can help form people's thinking. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. My thanks to each of you for getting online from the various parts of the world in a morning in the UK and an evening here in Australia. I very much enjoyed being with you. Thank you to everybody who's been here listening and being so active on our question and answer line. And with that, we promised you an hour. Our hour is at an end, but thank you for joining, and we'll see you at a future event. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.